Welcome to Azure Community Live, an online meetup about Azure for the community, created by the community. I'm your host, Lars Klint, and the idea behind this online meetup is that anyone, anywhere, with an internet connection, that's important, can be part of the Azure community. I live in rural Australia. I actually have llamas in that paddock right behind me. That's how rural I am. And I can't go to meetups in my nearest major city. And so this is an opportunity for me to join and give back. And speaking of giving back, if you want to share your passion for Azure, or on whatever level or whatever topic you want to talk about, get in touch with us either via Twitter or YouTube or the call for papers that is on the website. It can be anything on any level, so total up to you. So now for me, let me get to the speaker for this event this evening. It's 7 o'clock here in Australia on the eastern coast. Orin Thomas is a Principal Cloud Operations Advocate. That is an actual title, yes, at Microsoft, and has written more than 36 books for Microsoft Press on topics including Windows Server, Windows Client, Azure, Office 365, Virtual Kitten Wrangling, System Center, Exchange Server, Security, and SQL Server. And you can follow him on Twitter at Orin Thomas. So with that, welcome, Orin.
Thank you very much, Lars. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about security in Azure. It's a fairly straightforward talk. It's probably somewhere around 100, 200 level, and hopefully you'll learn a couple of things. Okay, so start this talk with a particularly difficult statistic for a lot of people, which is that through 2020, 95% of cloud security failures are going to be the customer's fault. Isn't that a wonderful thing for a vendor like Microsoft to say, oh, this is going to be your fault? Now, what does that mean? Well, it means, and it's not just an abrogation of responsibility. What it means is that the most likely cause of security problems in the cloud is the customer misconfiguring some of the settings in the cloud. If you look at a lot of security breaches, it's not usually because someone has had the perfect security. It's because often they've done something silly or they haven't done something properly, and the attackers get through that particular barrier. They put a beautiful big gate up in front of their castle, but they forget to lock it, and the attackers come in and just lift the gate. So what we say, and one of the things that we like to remind people of, is this idea that cloud security is a shared responsibility, which means that there's some things that are the cloud provider's fault, that the cloud provider is responsible for, and there's a lot of things that you are responsible for. Now, this is obviously something that would be a bit drawn up by lawyers. It's something that will be part of your agreement that you sign up to, one of those terms and conditions. But what the cloud provider, and in this case, I'm obviously talking about Microsoft because this is an Azure meetup, is responsible for is the things like the physical assets. What does that mean? It means that we're responsible for the data center infrastructure itself. The buildings, we've got to make sure that the buildings themselves are secure. You can't just walk in off the street into an Azure data center. There is a degree of physical security that you are required, or you would need to get through to get into the building. It's not just, sitting in a shed next to the local Bunnings. Then there's data center operations. We're responsible as Microsoft for that. Now, what does that mean? It means that anybody that works in the data center is vetted by us. I know myself, having visited an Azure data center, that there's a process that you need to go through, and it's quite extensive, and it involves security checks to even enter a Microsoft data center. And the same would apply to those of our competitors. And then there's the cloud infrastructure and fabric. Now, being responsible for those means that we make sure that any vulnerabilities that might exist in the fabric are actually addressed by us. Now, what does that mean? It means that, remember the Heartbleed process of vulnerability? Well, the Heartbleed process of vulnerability was one that might have allowed you to go and exploit something that went on in the processor, to go and look at stuff that might have been running in another virtual machine on the same host. Clearly, that's a problem for cloud security because in the cloud, you don't know who else might be running a workload on the same physical hardware. Maybe anybody could be. So you don't want, that anybody to be an attacker. Well, we are responsible for making sure that vulnerabilities like that are patched. So that's our responsibility. Now, there's a thing that we've put here nicely and said joint responsibility. Now, what joint responsibility means is that we're going to provide you with a set of tools on how to go and address this, but that it's your responsibility to do something about it. Let me give you an example. Virtual machines and networks. You would deploy a virtual machine running Linux or Windows into Azure, and that virtual machine at the time of deployment will be fully up to date. It will have all of the appropriate security updates applied to it. But the moment you deploy it, it becomes your problem. It becomes your responsibility. It's like when you drive a car off the lot. You buy a car, up until the moment you drive it off the lot, it's the dealer's responsibility. But the moment you drive it off the lot, if you drive it off the lot and get into a car accident, that's your responsibility. Obviously, there's things like guarantees in terms of, the reliability of the vehicle and so on and so forth, but you understand the general gist. The same for apps and workloads. We can give you a set of best practices. We can give you a set of tools to analyze your apps for security vulnerabilities, but it's up to you to actually come in and make sure that you're not writing insecure code, that your workloads are secure. If you write a crappy app that's got a crappy authentication component, it's not our fault that someone got in and pulled all your users' passwords. It's because, well, that's your responsibility. It's your app. Doesn't matter that you're running it in our infrastructure, because if you were running it in anybody's infrastructure, it would be a problematic app. And then there's the data. We'll give you tools to secure your data, but you don't have to look at too many security breaches to know that there's a lot of data that's been out there in, for example, storage accounts or S3 buckets that has been let out to the world. And why has it been let out to the world? Because people haven't actually secured those storage accounts, secured those buckets properly. So we'll give you tools to do that, but it's your responsibility to actually use them. We can only give you the tools. And to sort of forestall any questions about this, why don't we secure all of this for you? Well, the reality is that a lot of people don't like certain settings turned on by default. You only have to listen to people complain about Windows Update and Windows Update constantly rebooting their machine. People don't like installing updates. And if you gave people the option of not installing updates, they wouldn't do it. So we found a balance with Windows in terms of we kind of force you to do it once a month eventually. Well, people in the cloud, when you're running your own server infrastructure, obviously that's a bit more mission critical than clients. So we will give you absolutely every tool. We will give you all of the stuff that you need to know how to use it, but it will be your responsibility to turn it on. It's like a seatbelt being in a car. We can put the seatbelt in the car, but we can't make you click, clack, front and back. Okay, so the way that I like to, and we like to characterize talks at Microsoft, is we like to use a narrative-driven approach. And in this one, I'm going to use the narrative of a fictional organization. And I like to put this up the front, even though it's fairly obvious that I've made these people up, that everybody is fictional and it doesn't exist. So if you recognize anything or a particular problem, well, it's not because I've copied you or know you, it's just because a lot of people do this sort of thing. Anyway, so in this particular story, I've got a character named Wally Drago. This goes down very well overseas when I tell this story overseas, tell this session overseas. Anyway, let's pretend Wally works as the IT operations and security lead in the Dubbo head office of Tailwind Traders. Being Australian, when I'm presenting overseas, I absolutely love to use what would be completely normal to us town names, but to an American or someone in Europe or someone in Asia is a completely ridiculous town name. And as wonderful as the city of Dubbo is, it's quite a ridiculous name. Anyway, so Tailwind Traders, head office is in Dubbo. Anyway, Wally's manager, Charlene, wants him to migrate all the VMs from a co-location facility that they've got in Wagga. Again, probably not too many co-location facilities in the real Wagga, But if you're talking to a foreign audience, you can make Wagga a lot bigger than it actually is. Anyway, so Wally's manager wants him to migrate a whole lot of VMs from Wagga to Azure. Now, the reason, or one of the reasons that Charlene wants Wally to do this, is that Charlene, like a lot of people out there, believes that the cloud is automatically far more secure than running it on-prem. And there's a degree of truth to that statement, but it all comes down to the fact that, well, you've got to lock it up, right? You've got to turn on all the security settings. Your house can have the best locks on it, but if you don't lock your door, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, here's a little image indicating what I think of that sort of thinking. That is, it's a bit of a dumpster fire. Okay, so Wally's got the following goals. He wants to understand, if he's moving all these workloads to the cloud, how he can improve the security configuration. Because Wally, like most of us, is an on-prem person. He's grown up thinking about security from an on-prem perspective. That means that he knows how to solve security problems from that perspective. But the cloud's a different thing. It's all sitting there out in public. Maybe it's like putting it onto the public internet. You know, no one here would deploy a box naked onto the internet without turning on a firewall, without having it on a perimeter network. Wally knows that, but how does that work in the cloud? How do you protect it in the cloud? He also wants to minimize the permanent assignment of administrative roles. So what that means is that Wally wants to make sure that rather than any role being permanently assigned, any role is only temporarily assigned. It's called just-in-time administration, and I'll go into it a bit later. He wants to restrict access to sensitive storage accounts because he's very aware that people have had storage accounts out there that have been exposed to the public and that confidential company information has been downloaded from those. He wants to be notified because one of the things that he's migrating is he's migrating some SQL databases into Azure SQL, and he's aware of SQL injection attacks, and he wants to know if someone's basically, tiptoeing around their web application, trying to see if they can perform an SQL injection attack. So he wants to be notified if that occurs. And he wants to be able to analyze Azure Active Directory and Azure telemetry for any suspicious activity. He wants to know, for example, if someone is logging on from Denmark or if someone's logging on from Brazil, which, for a mob or an organization that's running out of Wagga Wagga, that would be an unusual bit of activity. Okay, so let's get into it. How does Wally understand the quality of Tailwind Trader's cloud security posture against security controls that are possible to configure? That is, he knows he's gone and deployed the workload into Azure, but how does he assess the quality of the security steps that he's taken? Well, let me show you how you can do this with Azure Security Center and a thing called the Secure Score. So here I am in the Azure console, and the way this works is when you fire up the Azure console, you can enter a thing called Security Center. So we open up Secure Center, and there's a button within Secure Center called Secure Score. So I click on that, and it will bring up a secure score for me. So you can see here that I've got, or Wally's got, a secure score of 285 out of 515. So what Azure Security Center has gone and done is it's assessed all of the possible security configuration or security controls that can be applied to the workloads that are currently deployed in this subscription and given it a mark. And in this case, it said, well, out of all security controls, which would give you 515 points, you've applied enough points to get 285. And you can see that this score is broken down by category. See, we've got a networking category, an identity and access category, a data and storage category, and a compute and apps resource. So if I click on compute, it'll show me. Now, in this case, it's just an example. So we can see that I've got one virtual machine deployed, and it's giving me recommendations. And what Azure Security Center will do is it'll tell you, here's your overall score, and here's how you can improve it. Now, in this case, it's telling me that by applying just-in-time administration, I can turn up my security score, or Wally can up his security score by 30 points. So it's by the assignment of points. It's sort of like Microsoft's way of telling you, this is important. If we're giving a security score of 5, it's a less critical thing than something that we give 50 points to. So if we're giving you 30 points for it, then that's something that can substantially improve your security score. We can see that we can install a vulnerability assessment, that we can turn on the monitoring and health agent. We can do a whole lot of things. The next one is that we can go over and look at VMs specifically. So here I've got a VM named Tailwind Traders 2019A, and that there is a bunch of recommendations there, and I can click into that and I can see what those recommendations are. For example, close my management ports, turn in just-in-time network access, which I mentioned before, install endpoint protection. So I go back to my secure score and I can go and look at my networking resources. So here's my recommendations around networking. I can turn on adaptive network hardening. I should associate each subnet with a network security group. I should turn in just-in-time network access control. Go back to my secure score. Here I can look at my identity and access resources, and it'll analyze the configuration of Azure Active Directory. And here it's saying you should turn on MFA on any account that's got owner permissions on your subscriptions. So that's the first thing that Wally does. You can run Azure Security Center and get an idea of the security score. So what this does, what Azure Security Center does, is it allows you to go and look at your subscription and get an idea across a bunch of categories about what you can do to improve your security posture. This is a very easy one if you're a consultant or if you're working with Azure. If you go into a new company, you can run Azure Security Center, you can get a look at your secure score, and you can say, right, this is where it is when I started. And then a couple of weeks later, you show whoever your management is, your secure score, you show how you've improved it, and you say, look, I have tangibly improved the security of this particular subscription. So it measures what you have done compared to what you can do. So there's no reason to compare this to anybody else's score. Your total possible score will vary depending on what workloads you've got deployed and what configuration options are possible. Even if you don't change the configuration of your options, your secure score might change as newer security technologies become available. Two organizations can only have the same secure score if they have exactly the same resources deployed in exactly the same security configuration. And secure score will change, as I said, as new security configuration options become available over time. So, for example, as new network security options become available, they will be added to the secure score calculation. Now, auditors cause more anxiety for IT pros than hackers. Why? Because hackers are this unknown thing that may or may not be attacking your network. Auditors turn up on a frequent basis and have something to do with legal and annoy the hell out of your manager. So one of the things that Wally wants to know is how can Wally assess the compliance of Tailwind Traders Azure security configuration against known benchmarks, such as the Azure Sentinel for Internet Security benchmark or the ISO 27001 benchmark. Okay, so let me show you how policy and compliance works. So here I am in the Azure console, and I click on regulatory compliance. And when I click on regulatory compliance, it will give me a list of, instead of a secure score, which is our score, Microsoft's score, calculated against any possible security control that can exist. Instead, what we do is we look at the security controls that are listed in each one of these standards and assess your security controls configuration against these standards. Now, the important thing to know about these standards is these standards don't assess every possible security control that exists in the cloud. They assess them a bunch of chosen set of security controls that were available when the standard was drafted. And if you know anything about the drafting of standards, you know that this actually takes quite a while to do. So to an extent, Azure Security Center secure score is probably a better way of looking at your security, but an auditor probably won't be looking at it that way. They'll probably be looking at it in terms of one of these known international standards. So we can see each one of these standards, and here we can see Azure Sentinel for Internet Security. And we can see, for example, if we open up storage accounts, that we need to make sure our default network access rule for storage accounts is set to deny. So at the moment, we've got a storage account deployed in this particular subscription that's actually not got a deny rule applied to it, which means it may be accessible from the internet. So what it does is it gives us an assessment, and it gives us information about how we can go and remediate that particular configuration problem. So we can go down and we can look at the virtual machine assessment. And here we're looking at whether or not the operating system disks are encrypted. Disk encryption should be applied to virtual machine. And it's saying, okay, none of you, of all of your virtual machines here, you've not encrypted any of the disks. And this violates a particular control in this particular security benchmark. And data disks need to be encrypted. And again, all of these VMs have data disks, none of them are encrypted. System updates need to be installed. Now you can see that one, I've got a green mark. Wally's got a green mark, which means that all of his virtual machines are actually up to date. We can look at the ISO 27001 standard. And again, you'll see that this will give you the area of the document that's appropriate, and it will give you information about the particular standard and tell you, for example, whether or not you're meeting it. For example, here we're looking at control of operational software. Now, to meet this particular guideline within ISO 27001/17, which is the cloud security standard, adaptive application control needs to be turned on. And all that is application whitelisting on virtual machines that are running in the cloud. And here we can see communication security. So again, it will give you a breakdown. So even though when it comes to having an audit, you do need an auditor to go and do an audit, in preparing for an audit, you can use something, or you can use Azure Security Center to actually prepare you for the audit so that you've got rid of all of the low-hanging fruit. And if your auditor's going to pull you up on something in your security deployment, what they're going to pull you up on is they're going to pull you up on something that you probably wouldn't have seen because it's obvious. Because all of the obvious stuff will automatically have been flagged by Azure Security Center. Okay, now these are the benchmarks that Azure Security Center currently looks at. Azure SIS 1.1.0, PCI DSS 3.2.1, ISO 27001, and SOC TSP. Okay, so we've looked at Secure Score, we've looked at compliance. Let's talk about how we resolve the most urgent cloud security issues. And we can do that through a thing called Resource Security Hygiene. Let me show you how it works. So here I am in Azure Security Center. I've clicked on my recommendations. So here is the list of itemized recommendations. You saw this a little earlier. It says this is what you should do in order of priority. And when you're dealing with the security of your cloud subscription, it's good to come to something like this and say, okay, this is all of the stuff that I want to knock off. This is the stuff I want to deal with. You want to make sure that there's none of these red flags or red lines problematic with your subscription. At least then you go in and you haven't done anything particularly stupid. So turn on MFA. Here we've got one that says install endpoint protection. Now, some of these you can resolve directly from the Azure console. So here you see I turn on endpoint protection, and what I can do is actually from the Azure console, I can inject or install Microsoft's anti-malware protection solution on these particular VMs. You can also use other third-party stuff, and that will actually protect you as well and be flagged by Azure Security Center. So I do that, and then the score doesn't update immediately, but within 12 to 24 hours, the score will come back and reassess that machine, and that recommendation will be taken away. Another one that we could do is we could look at disk encryption. Remember I said that the disks weren't encrypted? Well, here, this is at the moment something that isn't automated. There's a bit of mucking around that is required to do this, and it also depends on whether or not the virtual machine SKU that you're using actually supports encrypted disks. And just-in-time network access. So just-in-time network access, here it's saying turn that on. And all I need to do is I need to say I'm going to enable JIT on a particular virtual machine. Now, what just-in-time access does is it allows you to open up a window for a limited amount of time to a virtual machine. For example, rather than having your SSH port open all the time or your RDP port open all the time, what just-in-time access does is that you go and request that access to RDP be opened. It's normally completely blocked, but for the next half hour or the next 10 hours, depending on how you configure it, access to that port will be granted from the IP address that you specify. This means that the management port's only open when you need it, because as you know, 99.9% of the time, you never need management access to a workload that's running in the cloud. You only go and perform management on an irregular basis. So at that point in time, you go and do it, you open up the port, you go through the gate, you do what you need to do, you come out, and then that gets locked back up. Instead of what we've done for forever, where you've always been able to connect to your workloads. Again, when I got started as a systems administrator on a host that I was remotely managing over the internet, this is way back in the 90s, and I was using VNC to manage a box that was running in a data center in Colorado. Now, the problem with that was, back then, you didn't configure it was running on NT4. It didn't have Windows Firewall built into NT4 at the time, and technically anybody in the world could try and make an administrative connection on that that VNC port. And of course, VNC security wasn't that good, so thankfully I never got hacked, and I had a pretty good password and pretty good accounts. But not necessarily the world's most secure configuration, but it was the late 90s, and that's the way we rolled. Okay, so here, this is a Windows box, and what I'm doing is I'm deleting all of the possible admin ports except for 3389, which is used by RDP. And what I'm saying here is I want to allow, or Wally wants to allow, access when requested from a particular set of IP addresses. So let's pretend that Tailwind Traders, which is Wally's company, their Wagga office has a particular block of public IPv4 addresses that they always come from, because that's what their ISPs assigned them. Well, you can set just-in-time admin up to, once that has been requested, only allow access from those connections. So even from those connections, unless access has been granted, and you've got to have an account that's got the ability to actually request that permission, then you can't make that connection happen. So here I'll put in 128.250.213/.0/24, and that was the first network I worked on way back in the mid-90s, back at the University of Melbourne. And here I'm saying, okay, maximum request time is 10 hours. So the way that that's configured is that I'd be able to request access, and then I'd have to come from that subnet at the old arts building at the University of Melbourne, which is probably not assigned to anymore, but I could make an RDP connection from that. Okay, so resource security hygiene. Computer apps, it'll look at your VMs and computers, scale sets, cloud services, app services, containers, and your compute resources. The networking category will look at your network, give you a network map. It'll also provide you with the ability to do adaptive network hardening, or it analyzes your network traffic and then will lock off and say, okay, you are only using these ports, like automatically block anything that you're not using, because again, most attackers do something unusual rather than something normal. IoT hubs and resources allows you to go and secure your IoT resources. Data and storage allows you to analyze your SQL and analytics resources. And identity and access allows you to look at your account security in Azure Active Directory, as well as your Key Vault security. Okay, so the next thing that Wally wants to do is he wants to make sure that admin tasks are only performed by authorized users. Those of you who've ever seen me speak at a tech ed way back in the day, when it used to be up on the Gold Coast, know that I used to ask the audience, who here has looked through their Active Directory and seen members of the domain admins group that no longer work at the company? And sometimes it was like 30 or 40% of the audience had put their hand up. Some of the audience didn't put their hand up, were in that position. But one of the problems that we've had with our traditional model of security is that the way that we've assigned security is that we've basically given you police powers or administrative powers all the time. You're basically, to use a comic book analogy, you're always Superman. Whereas the way that permissions should work is it should be a bit more like Green Lantern. That is, unless you've got the Green Lantern ring on, or unless you've got the appropriate ring on, and if those of you that know Green Lantern know that there's a whole lot of different colours of rings that give you different abilities to do different things, well, that's how permissions should work. So that the other advantage of that is that what you want to do is you want to make sure that when attackers attack an organization, they go for a thing called persistence. And persistence is where they've infiltrated the network and they've given themselves permissions so that when they want to launch an attack, they can use those permissions. Well, if you remove permissions from everybody and only allow permissions to be granted based on someone requesting them, then you are shutting down another avenue for attack. And security is not about protecting from everything. What it's about doing is about systematically going through and shutting down every possible angle that might be used to attack your infrastructure. So Wally wants to make sure that admin tasks such as account password changes are only performed by authorized users. And he wants a log of when those permissions are used. So again, if you think about adding someone to the domain admins group, well, unless you've got some pretty great auditing, you don't know what they're doing. But if you've got a system that logs every time someone actually requests domain admin access, well, then you're like, okay, so Lars went and requested domain admin access at 6:30 p.m. And then what did Lars do? Well, he went and changed Troy Hunt's password to I like driving larders or something like that, which Lars might do just to mess with Troy. Anyway, let me show you how this works. That should have got a laugh from you, Lars. Okay, so here I am in the Azure console, and I am signed on as a user named Don Funk. So Don wants to be able to change passwords. Let me show you how that works. Don goes into the list of users in Azure Active Directory. He goes to Sam Abolros's account and he goes and clicks Reset Password. Now, the information he gets here is that the password cannot be reset. Now, this is because Don Funk's account at this point in time is a standard user account, does not have permission to go and change passwords. So what Don can do is Don can go into a thing called privileged identity management. Now, privileged identity management, when you set it up, allows a user to request certain roles. You tell them, okay, Don is eligible for these particular roles. And then you set the conditions under which Don can get those roles. It might be that you automatically approve and just say, right, Don, whenever you want that role, you get it, and you get it for half an hour, and you can go and change as many passwords as you want. When you request it, that's actually going to be logged, and obviously we're logging all of your activity. Or you can do it, and you can force Don to perform multi-factor authentication. So you say, sure, Don, you can go and use your privileges, but I'm only going to allow you to use your privileges once you've authenticated with your phone. That way, if someone's stolen Don's password and they're sitting in, Stockholm, being a hacker, well, they can't just, if they've got Don's password, go and change Sam's password because they still need to have Don's phone to authenticate. Or you can go even further. If they want further permissions, and you'll have to make this assessment yourself, you can say, okay, I want someone to sign off on this. So if I've got someone who's got permissions to go and modify Azure Active Directory, I need a manager to approve that request. So a request goes through the manager, it goes into their email, they go and click on a thing saying, yes, I authorize this. And that manager might just be an authorized, doesn't mean that they need any permissions, they're just within that chain of authorization. And that's another way to make sure that privileged accounts are only used when they're meant to be, as opposed to when an attacker gets access to a privileged account, because that's what every attacker wants, and the attacker wants to use it whenever they want. So I go in here, I click my roles, or Don clicks my roles, and Don sees that he's got access to the password administrator role. So he clicks activate. Now, it comes up with an activation screen. He clicks activate again. And when he clicks activate, it says, how long do you want to activate it for? And then it gives me the option, or gives Don the option, of providing an activation reason, which gets written to the log. So one of the things that you might put into your policies and procedures is you might say, okay, if you're going to do a password change, or if you're going to activate this role, you write down whose password you're going to go and change, so that we can see that you haven't gone and changed someone random's password, that you've actually changed the password that you said you were going to change when you activated the role. So Don clicks activate. The role therefore goes and activates. Comes back in and it says, okay, your access is valid for the next hour. So then Don can go back to Azure Active Directory, doesn't need to log out or anything like that, goes back to users, clicks on Sam, clicks reset password, and now Don can go and reset Sam's password. So that means that Wally's set it up so that his help desk people are only able to change passwords when they've requested that role. It means that if someone got access to Don's password, they couldn't change the password unless they requested that role. Now, here I didn't require any authorization, but if you were doing this in the real world, yeah, you'd require at least multi-factor authentication on something like that. So, privileged role membership is only granted for a limited amount of time. Roles can be configured to require staff to perform MFA. Roles can be granted automatically, as you saw in that example. Roles can be automatically recorded in logs. You can even have an email automatically sent every time someone requests a role. And almost all roles should be managed by PIM. That means that when you do an assessment of all of your authorized roles, you can actually say, you know what, any of these roles, any privileged roles, and this gets beyond just as your Active Directory to any role-based access control roles, should actually be requested. So if someone wants to use a privilege in Azure, they should actually request that privilege, and otherwise they should just have a standard user account. It's just another layer of security. Okay, so Wally Drongos' mate, Lard's Kookaburra, as you can see, I might have turned the Australian up to 11 when I was presenting this overseas, was recently fired because he left the security of one of the company's storage accounts stark naked, leading data to be spread from here to Wollongong. Wollongong is a terribly, terribly funny word if you are speaking to an audience full of people from Texas. Okay, so how can Wally ensure that only certain IaaS VMs can access a specific storage account? Let me show you how that works by configuring storage account traffic restrictions. So here I am back in the Azure console. Now, what I'm doing is I'm setting up some subnets here. At the moment, I've got a virtual network and I've got a public subnet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create a private subnet. I'm going to set things up so that any VM that's running on the public subnet can't access this particular storage account. But a VM that's running on a private subnet can access that particular storage account. The only computers that'll be able to access that storage account will be running on that specific private subnet that I'm about to create. So I go and add a new subnet. I type in the name of the subnet, call it private. I give it the subnet range, 192.168.15.0/24. And here I'm specifying which service endpoints can access that subnet. So I'm setting it up and I'm saying, right, I'm going to allow the storage endpoint access to this subnet because I've got to allow storage access before I can restrict that access. If I don't do that, then it doesn't have access at all. So I've got that subnet, it's gone and created. The next thing I'm going to go and do is create a storage account. So I type storage into the Azure console. I'm going to add a new storage account, and you can make this modification to an existing one. I'm just specifying the details. So I'm putting it into a particular resource group. It needs a unique name, being a storage account. Put it in Southeast Asia. I don't really care about performance. I don't have to care about it. Don't need to worry about the replication or anything that works with any storage account. But here I'm just making it locally redundant storage. On the Advanced tab, I can specify virtual networks. So you can see here by default, that storage account is accessible by all networks. Now we don't want that. We want it to be made enabled, accessed by the selected network. So when we do that, we get a new dialog change, and we can select here a virtual network. So here I'm specifying my virtual network called new VNet, and then it gives me the list of subnets on new VNet, and I can choose which subnets to allow access to that storage account. So I don't want to allow access to public, I only want to allow access to private. So I've set this storage account up so that only VMs that are connected to that private virtual network's subnet, and no other subnets on that virtual network, and no other subnets within my subscription, can access the data stored on that storage account. All I need to do now is click Review and Create, and go and create that storage account. And that storage account is then locked down and is only going to be accessible to a virtual machine that I connect to that particular subnet. So we see that deploy. It's deployed, and that's all you have to do to secure a storage account so that it can only be accessed by a single virtual machine.
Now,
okay, so locking down your service endpoints.
I had a question for you. So this is come through on the YouTubes. Do you have any advice for organizations who are not used, they're not used to some of these security measures being in place, and the IT folk are always used to having admin rights to absolutely everything? What do you advise for that kind of scenario? It's almost an educational one, isn't it?
It is. So one of the things is you go and ask your IT folks and you say, okay, so what's your best security practice? It's not that you're stopping them from having admin rights. It's that you are putting controls in place. Instead of, the old nuclear launch keys, which I suppose are still there, right, where you had two different people turn the keys. Yep. Well, anybody should be aware of the risk. Anybody who's an IT pro or an IT admin should be aware of the risk of a misused administrative account. So all you're doing is you're putting in place some extra steps to protect those accounts. And once most IT pros are aware that they can do something like this, most of them are completely on board with it. There's sort of a trope around that IT pros are very resistant to change because they're sticks in the mud or they're fuddy-duddies. The reality is that most IT pros are resistant to change, not because they hate change, but because they've seen change go so catastrophically wrong that they've been burnt by it. But if you're making a change that improves the security of something, most people will go along with that if it makes sense. If you come up with some stupid procedure, no. And the other way to do this is always do these sort of security hardening things on an incremental basis. Obviously, you want to improve your security as quickly as possible, but you've got to improve your security in a way that makes sure that you're not breaking stuff, because the more that you tighten things, then you might find it's sort of like, might find that there's problems. It's sort of like every IT pro is very reluctant to disable a service account that's been put into a particular, there's always some idiot that's put a service account in the domain admins group. And you sit there and go, this is an appalling bit of security configuration. So in that case, you might break it just to find out what it is that you broke so that you can actually fix it. But you're also reluctant to do it because sometimes you do that and then the whole system shuts down and the world ends. So and then you have to reboot the planet. So,
all right. Well, thanks for that.
No worries. Cool. Okay. So locking down your service endpoints, make sure you lock them down to the particular resources that need access to it. So again, your security configuration should be as tight as you can reasonably make it from the beginning. Sit down and go, what should have access to this, rather than deploying it and go, does everything in the world have access to this? And this is a bit of a problem because in the public cloud, originally, a lot of things had access to everything. And we're getting a change. Again, you might have heard the expression that identity is the new security control plane. As true as that is, The reality is that people still also think of network location as a security control plane as well. And as much as we want them to go through that Gestalt switch and start thinking about it the other way, we've also noticed that, when some people are saying, okay, I'm putting up a serverless application on the internet, how do I restrict it to a specific set of IP addresses? At one stage, you couldn't do it. Now you kind of can. Anyway, getting back to the talk. Barumbatok, I was looking for the weirdest names I could find, and Barumbatok was actually one of the weirdest names I could find. City Council was recently in the news after an SQL injection attack exposed a ton of data to everyone and their dog on the internet. So how can Wally improve the security of Tailwind Traders SQL instances? So let me show you about Azure SQL Advanced Data Security. So here we are in the Azure console, and I have an Azure SQL server called TT SQL Azure. And within that SQL server, I have a database called a Vector Sigma, which those of you who are Transformers fans, because you can probably see a bunch of them behind me, know that that was actually a database that resided on Cybertron. Okay, so if you click on Advanced Data Security, what you can do is you can turn on Advanced Data Security for your Azure SQL service. So this basically lights up a bunch of security features. Now, because it's Azure Security Center, you're actually paying, a per node on a per node basis. So you pay, I think it's about $15 extra per SQL server to have it monitored by Azure Security Center. Because, ultimately the cloud's not a charity, right? So we're specifying where we want all of our log data to go. Here, I'm turning on vulnerability scans. I'm saying, okay, do a periodic scan of this particular database and then send me an email report to this particular email address. My advanced threat protection settings, send them. Now, in terms of advanced threat protection, I want to be notified in the following circumstances. If someone tries an SQL injection attack against this database, send me a notification. If there's a vulnerability that the database is assessed and there's a vulnerability to SQL injection, turn that on. If someone is accessing the database in a way that indicates that data is being exfiltrated, they go through the database, maybe they're just trying to make a copy of it, right? Well, notify me if that sort of thing's going on. If someone performs an unsafe action, like tries to drop a bunch of tables, well, notify me about it, maybe block it, right? And if there's an anomalous client login, if there's an unusual thing about a client login, notify me about that as well. So here I've said go and notify me about all of those, and then I go and click OK. And I save that configuration there. So that is turning on very easily advanced data security. And a lot of these things are just a matter of going and turning it on fairly quickly. So advanced threat protection, as I said, vulnerability to SQL injection, potential SQL injection, unusual location access, unusual data center location access. One of the things that has occurred in the cloud is originally many cloud providers sort of assumed or whitelisted their own data centers. So what attackers would do was spin up resources in the same subscription in another location and then use that as an attack into your own location. So here it can say, okay, if someone's reading this database from an unusual location, flag that. Access from an unfamiliar principal. Is someone using an account that's never been used to do this before? Well, that might be a newly created account by an attacker. Again, you're getting notified. It might be completely fine. Or someone who's trying to brute force SQL credentials. Is someone constantly trying to log on with one of Lars's passwords? I'm really hot. I'm really hot and Danish. Oh, look, I just found another car in a shed somewhere in rural Victoria. All of those are possibly legitimate Lars passwords, but whether or not. Yeah, Troy Hunt's website, pwnedpasswords.com. Anyway, so make sure if you turn this on, you're going to be notified about all of this. Okay, so again, my Australian jokes, because this is absolutely, if you're ever speaking overseas, turn up the Aussie to 11 and you'll get, a couple of points on your evals for it. So like spiders, snakes, sharks, crocodiles, lizards, blue-ringed octopus, stinging jellyfish, and manta rays that killed Steve Irwin, that got a laugh from the American audience in Florida. Predators tend to lurk in network and infrastructure before they attack. Remember I talked about people getting persistence? Well, people tend to have persistence for some time before they actually launch an attack. But if you've got really good authentication logs and security logs and you know how to analyze those, you can often find an attacker that may have got access to your network but haven't launched an attack yet. So how can Wally Drongo go about detecting suspicious activity in the Tailwind Traders as your Active Directory instance? So in the last demo, pardon?
Before you go to the last demo, I have another question for you, which I think was pertinent at the
Sure.
time there. It's actually a good question. So why is security a feature with extra cost in Azure? Like a lot of the services, for example, VNet integration for API management and for Azure Functions is an extra cost. Why is that if it's so important?
Because people at Microsoft and people generally made an assessment about what people were willing to pay for. So obviously we don't throw it in as part of the base cost because what happened is that and this is a question that gets asked all the time, it's like, why don't you include this all the time? And it turns out that the moment you turn it on, people start screaming because some people think that they can do it better and would actually be turned off by having all of these security features turned on. It's sort of like Linux and Windows Server. Windows Server and Linux operating systems by default can be made much more secure than they ship out of the box. There's a whole lot of things that you can turn on in terms of security controls, but you've got to choose to do so. Some of these security controls can cause problems. Some of them can restrict you from legitimate activity as well as illegitimate activity, because every security control you put in place does stop you from doing something that you might want to do, but probably shouldn't do. An example is that there might be someone who wants to run a particular form of malware within a VM. Okay, so maybe someone wants to run malware in a VM. Yep. Now, to an extent, you can do that, although there are protections built into the platform itself. There's a story about Mark Rusinovich running some malware and then having Azure automatically throttle him. But what it comes down to is people are very picky about this sort of stuff. So what we do is we almost offer you the basic set of services that we know that people demand. And then we have here's all of your optional extras. But we know that a lot of people don't want those optional extras. There's some people who are like, we don't care about your anti-malware solution. We've got our own. We're good. You know, would anybody be particularly happy if every virtual machine that you deployed running Windows Server had Microsoft anti-malware protection installed on it? Probably not. Does that answer your question?
I believe it does. Well, it wasn't my question, but I'll take that as an answer.
Yeah, no, it's just that, yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable question, and I sometimes think that when you sign up for Azure, you should be able to sign up for the option where you pay a bit more, and then everything's lit up. All the security options are lit up. But at the moment, that doesn't exist, mostly because it's not something that customers demanded. And there's also, we've got our security solutions, right? You can use Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel to go and analyze workloads running in other people's clouds. It may be that you have a multi-cloud solution and you want to use someone else's solution to monitor your Azure resources. Yeah. So that's another reason why it's not turned on by default.
Lovely.
Okay, so I was talking about analyzing logs. I'm going to show you how to do that using Sentinel. Okay, so here I am in the Azure console. I'm going to type in Sentinel. So Sentinel is a security incident and event management system and a security operations and automatic response system. But we're mostly just going to talk about it from the SIEM perspective. I believe you had Sarah talking a couple of weeks ago. She would have probably gone into this in a lot more detail. So we're going to add a new Sentinel workspace. This is basically just where Sentinel's going to store its stuff. And I've already got a workspace, so I'm adding, that's basically the Tailwind Traders Azure AD data store. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create some data connectors. And all a data connector does is it ingests or imports data on a regular basis into Sentinel so that Sentinel can start doing all of this funky stuff with it. So here I'm adding an Azure AD connector, and I'm going to connect the connector so that Azure Active Directory sign-in logs and audit logs are automatically taken out of Azure Active Directory and imported into Sentinel. Now, they're still there where they were, but I'm ingesting that data into my security incident and event management system that's running in the cloud, which means that I'll be able to analyze that using the tool set that's provided by the SIEM. So my audit logs and my sign-in logs. I can also go in and add some Azure Active Directory connectors, and this will allow me to pull in other Azure Active Directory logs, not just the sign-in logs, but other logs as well. So again, I can go through and connect that and specify how that works. And I can also do the identity protection log. So if I've enabled Azure Active Directory identity protection, I've lit that up, I can ingest that log. So all of this data can be imported and then correlated by the security incident and event management system. So you can see here that I've got a bunch of this. At the time that this video or this demo was put together, there was 25 connectors. There's always new connectors, and you can see here that we've even got a connector for AWS. So if you're using AWS, you can ingest data from AWS into Azure. So that again comes back to that question about why do we not light this up by default? Because you might be using a multi-cloud strategy and you might be managing, you might primarily be working in someone else's cloud and then just have some resources over in Azure. So here I'm opening the connector page for the Azure Active Directory connector. And I've got 3 workbooks. Now, a workbook is a way of looking at the data. It's a pre-configured set of queries that allows you to see information about the data that you've gathered. So here I can look at my sign-in logs. So I click on that connector, I click on that workbook, and then I can view the details of that workbook. And this looks a bit like a Power BI dashboard. And what it'll do is it'll give me a specific dashboard telling me information about Azure Active Directory sign-ins. So we can see in this particular case, I've had, in the last 5 minutes, there has been 3 sign-in logs, all from Australia, all from Melbourne. So this allows me to see who's been logging in from where. And again, when it gets more data, it can then flag anomalous logins and say, hey, this one is the same account, but suddenly it logged in from somewhere unusual, and you'll be able to see that, as well as using something called identity protection, which would actually find that for you. Now, you can see here that I've even had a sign-in status, which was pending user action. That means that I was multi-factor authentication prompted on that particular sign-in. So I can see a lot more information. So you've got your default logs, and default logs look like default logs, which is a bit ugly, or you can import them into Sentinel or configure Sentinel to automatically import them, and then suddenly you'll start getting dashboards telling you interesting things, which is what a security incident and event management system's about. It's about correlating events so that you can start to tell a story about a security incident. So it's entire intelligent security analytics, and it's not just for Azure. It'll do all of your stuff at cloud scale. So one of the limitations of security incident and event management systems traditionally is they sat on-prem, which meant that they sat usually in a physical box. They had a limited amount of storage. That meant that they could only ingest a certain amount of data, and then their way of analyzing that data would be dependent on how up-to-date they were with their algorithms. If you're running it in the cloud, obviously those algorithms are being updated all the time. You can basically detect any threat that Microsoft's detected. So new attacks leave certain traces in the event log telemetry. As those new attacks are detected, the characteristics of those attacks go in centrally. So it's like there's a central database. So it's not that your data is being pushed up to a central location. It's been that the recognition or the diagnosis of what that security event data means can be applied to your particular data by taking what's been learned from everybody else in the world that's connected to the same system. It allows you to investigate threats using AI. So this is the other advantage. In 20 years ago, if you were looking through event log data, you were searching for known clues based on what you knew. So you had a bunch of search strings or regular expressions that you ran on your security event logs, and those regular expressions would come back with a result, and you go, aha, I know that this is such and such because my regex found this particular thing in the log. AI is a lot better at looking at huge mountains of data and then teasing out things that a human would just never find because we just do not have the processing capacity to go through haystacks of that magnitude. It also allows you to respond. So you can set up automatic workbooks or automation that will actually, once a particular known threat has been found, you can trigger automation. It might be that, for example, someone starts trying to brute force a VM. You might have an automation that just shuts down the VM until someone can come and have a look at it, or does something else, like redeploys a new VM, or let's say a VM starts running malware or something like that. You can program in a response, or you can choose one of the pre-configured workbooks, or there's even workbooks that are sitting up on GitHub that allow you to automate responses to things. So a Sentinel playbook allows you to orchestrate a response, as I said. You can create new playbooks using Logic App workflows, with Security Center being the trigger for that workflow. Okay, anyway, in this session, I talked about Wally Drago, my great fictional example, and said Wally had a bunch of security goals. He wanted to understand the security configuration, how it could be improved. And we know that he went and looked at Azure Security Center to learn about all of the things that could be turned on in his particular subscription. He wanted to minimize the assignment of administrative roles, and he did that through privileged identity management. He wanted to restrict access to the storage accounts, and he did that through storage account firewall. Wanted to be notified in the event of SQL injection attacks, so we did that through SQL analytics. And he wanted to be able to analyze Azure AD and Azure telemetry for unusual activity, and he could do that through Sentinel. Anyway, if you want to know more about my team at Microsoft, you can go to itopstalk.com. This one's a little Mad Max Koala. That's our version of Ninja Cat in my particular team. And we have our website is itopstalk.com, which is our blog, and AsOps is our Twitter hashtag. Anyway, if you've got any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Very good. Thank you very much, Orin. That was actually really enlightening, because I am in the developer space, as you probably know, and I don't know much about any of this. It was certainly interesting. I had a couple of questions. Let's just see if anyone else has. So Dan from before about Azure Security, why some of these features aren't included, is also saying that there seems to be some quite high prices for some of this, I think is the question. API management to get VNet integration is something like 2,500 euros a month. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I know you're sort of not really in charge of pricing though. So
got nothing to do with me, so I can't again speak to the pricing. I would go with the company line, which is I'm sure our pricing is competitive, and I don't want to go much further than that. You've also got obviously other options. I know that some people use third-party services for some things, so I imagine that they're competitive with the third-party services, but I really can't speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So I just have one question, because you went through at the start the security score, and you had all of these delicious buttons that you could click on that says, oh, get 30 points for this, and it's almost like you can win a teddy bear. Now, should you just go blindly and click on all of these tips, or are there, like, there seems to be some sort of due diligence you need to make before you click them, or are they all safe?
So, no, no security control can be implemented without consequences to a certain extent, right? Because you're changing any configuration. Any configuration change can have unintended consequences. So test. Do one at a time. Understand what you are doing and, have a plan for rolling it back. It could be the most sensible thing in the world, but sometimes the most sensible security configuration changes cause problems because someone screwed something up in their initial configuration so badly that you've got, with everybody who's worked in IT for a long time has seen something that is absolutely stupidly configured, and there's a reason it's stupidly configured, or it hasn't been remediated, and that is because it's so much of a bit of spaghetti that you know that the moment you start pulling on one thread, the whole thing's going to fall on top of you. So always take that particular approach and incrementally apply security. Always incrementally apply security controls. Turn it on, see if it breaks anything. Assume that it will. Assume that something's going to go disastrously wrong. Don't be an optimist. Anybody who's been working in the industry for more than a certain amount of time is a pessimist when it comes to configuration. We probably, because we've all seen it go terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. And, it's the old thing, never push into production on a Friday afternoon.
What? Why not? Oh, wait. No, that's really good. So there were no other questions other than I think maybe next time we can get you on the show or as a meetup to talk about all of the toys in your office. I think that would get a lot of views. Because I'm just looking at them here and they're just like, they're just...
Well, there's nothing compared to the shed. If you go to my website, orinthomas.com, and you click on the Flickr page, there's all of the stuff that's sitting in my shed. This is just like the stuff that's distracting me at the moment.
It's very cool. So thank you so much, Orin, for joining. And again, if you watching this time want to be part of this and present, give us a call. I was going to say, but reach out on Twitter or through YouTube here, and we'd love to have you on the show. But thank you, Orin, and have a good evening. See ya.
Thank you very much. You too. See you, Lars.